For decades after August 5, 1962, photographer George Barris kept the negatives locked in a vault, refusing every offer from magazines, collectors, and biographers who wanted to see the complete set of images from Marilyn Monroe's final photo shoot. When reporters asked why, his answer never wavered: "Because I don't believe she killed herself, and I won't let these photographs become part of the suicide narrative." Barris had spent 6 weeks with Marilyn that summer, from her 36th birthday on June 1st through those golden July afternoons on the Malibu coast, and the woman he photographed and interviewed was not someone planning to end her life, she was planning her comeback. She had just been fired from Something's Got to Give by 20th Century Fox, yes, and she was exhausted from years of studio battles and failed marriages, yes, but she spoke constantly about the future, about the book they were creating together that would finally tell her story in her own words, about new film projects, about reinvention. The official report called it probable suicide from an overdose of barbiturates, but Barris saw those final photographs differently. He saw a woman who looked tired but hopeful, vulnerable but determined, someone standing at the edge of transformation, not death. And there was something else that bothered him, details he shared only in private conversations years later, about inconsistencies in the timeline, about people who were at Marilyn's house that night who were never mentioned in official reports, about how the woman who told him "I feel like I'm just getting started" on August 3rd could be dead less than 24 hours later. Those Malibu photographs became more than just pictures, they became the last testimony of a woman who thought she had time left, captured by the only person she trusted enough to reveal her unguarded self, frozen in California sunshine just weeks before Hollywood's greatest mystery would begin. Before we continue this story, please subscribe to our channel to support more untold Hollywood mysteries. June 1st, 1962 started like any other birthday, but for Marilyn Monroe, turning 36 felt like standing at a crossroads. The Something's Got to Give film set at 20th Century Fox should have been celebrating their star with champagne and cake, but instead the atmosphere was tense and cold. Studio executives were furious with Marilyn for her chronic lateness. Director George Cukor was exhausted from waiting hours for her to emerge from her dressing room, and whispers had already started that this might be Marilyn's last film. Into this toxic environment walked George Barris, a photographer who had worked with Marilyn before and who saw past the chaos to the frightened woman underneath. He approached her during a break with a genuine question: would she be interested in creating a book together, an autobiography told entirely in her own words, illustrated with photographs that showed the real Marilyn, not the manufactured icon. The way Barris later described this moment, Marilyn's entire demeanor changed. The defensive, distant movie star facade dropped away, and for the first time that day, he saw something like hope flicker across her face. "Don't believe anything you read about me," she told him, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Only believe this. Only believe what I tell you directly." They made plans to meet away from the studio, away from the handlers and executives and gossip columnists who had spent 15 years telling Marilyn's story for her, always getting it wrong, always turning her into either a joke or a tragedy, when the truth was so much more complicated. What George Barris didn't know on that June afternoon was that he had just been granted access to something unprecedented, 6 weeks alone with the world's most famous woman, during what would turn out to be the final chapter of her life, armed with a camera and Marilyn's desperate need to finally be understood. The project they discussed was titled Marilyn, Her Life in Her Own Words, and for Marilyn, this represented something more valuable than another movie role. It represented control. After 15 years of having her image manipulated by studio publicity departments, her words twisted by journalists, her private life dissected by gossip magazines, she would finally get to tell her own story with photographs that showed her as she actually was, not as Hollywood demanded she appear. But there was an urgency to her agreement that Barris noticed immediately, a sense that she felt time was running out, though neither of them could have imagined just how little time remained. The California coastline in summer 1962 possessed a particular quality of light that made even ordinary moments feel mythical. George Barris had chosen several locations along the Malibu shore for their photo shoots, private beaches where Marilyn could relax without the constant awareness of being watched. The first session took place in mid-June, and Barris later recalled being struck by how different Marilyn looked away from the studio. She arrived wearing simple clothes, a black turtleneck sweater and casual pants, her famous platinum blonde hair loose and unstyled, with minimal makeup. This was not the Marilyn Monroe that millions saw on movie screens. This was Norma Jean, the woman who existed before Hollywood's transformation. She brought along a Mexican blanket, and as the afternoon breeze picked up, she wrapped herself in it, sitting on the sand, staring out at the waves with an expression that Barris couldn't quite read. As Barris began taking photographs, Marilyn started talking, and once she started, years of suppressed truth came pouring out. She talked about her childhood, the foster homes, and orphanage, the feeling of being unwanted that had followed her throughout her life. She described abuse she had suffered, her mother's mental illness, the terror that she might inherit the same madness. Between these painful revelations, she would pause, sometimes for several minutes, just watching the waves, and Barris learned to keep his camera ready because some of his most powerful images came from these unguarded moments. Then, without warning, she would turn back to the camera and smile, that famous Marilyn smile, and the transformation was so complete that Barris understood for the first time just how much energy it took for her to constantly perform being the person the world expected. Over the 6 weeks of their collaboration, a pattern emerged that revealed something fundamental about Marilyn's state in that final summer. She would arrive for each photo shoot oscillating between two distinct modes, sometimes animated and hopeful, talking excitedly about the future, about film projects she wanted to pursue, about her dreams of being taken seriously as an actress. During these periods, Barris photographed a woman who looked genuinely happy, laughing into the wind, playing in the surf, her face open and relaxed. She told him about her plan to establish her own production company, about dramatic roles she wanted to pursue, about returning to acting classes in New York. But then, sometimes in the middle of a sentence, her mood would shift, the light would leave her eyes, her shoulders would slump, and she would fall into a silence that could last for 20 minutes or more. During these episodes, Barris would keep photographing but stop asking questions, and these images tell a very different story. The photographs from Marilyn's silent periods reveal a woman carrying an unbearable weight. You can see the exhaustion etched into her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands gripped the blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She would stare at the ocean, and Barris imagined she was thinking about all the ways her life had gone wrong despite the fame, her 3 failed marriages, her inability to have children, her dependence on barbiturates and sleeping pills, her reputation in Hollywood as difficult and unreliable, the weight of being Marilyn Monroe, of living up to an image created by publicity departments, had become too heavy to carry. George Barris took hundreds of photographs during their 6 weeks together, and when these images finally became available decades later, they revealed visual documentation of a woman in transformation. The earliest photographs from June show Marilyn looking relatively healthy and optimistic, smiling naturally, her body language open. She plays in the surf like a child. She poses with the Mexican blanket, looking directly at the camera with an expression that seems to say, "This is me, the real me." In these early images, you can see that Marilyn believes in the project they're creating together, but as the weeks progress into July, a change becomes visible. The smile looks more forced, the sparkle in her eyes dims, and there's a new quality that Barris later described as resignation. The contrast between public Marilyn Monroe and the private woman in these photographs is stark. In official studio portraits, Marilyn looks glamorous but artificial, every hair perfectly placed, wearing designer gowns, posed to maximize her sex appeal. But Barris's Malibu photographs show someone completely different, a woman in a simple sweater, hair messy from ocean wind, sitting on the sand looking like someone you might encounter at any beach. The power of these images lies precisely in their ordinariness, showing just a person, vulnerable and real and human. In one particularly striking series, Marilyn is wrapped in the blanket, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the Pacific with an expression of such profound loneliness it's almost painful to look at. These are the images that tell the most truth about what was happening in Marilyn's final weeks, about the battle she was losing. As their project moved into late July, Marilyn's mood became increasingly dark and unpredictable. She would sometimes cancel sessions at the last minute, calling to say she hadn't slept, that she was too exhausted. When they did meet, hopeful conversations about the future became less frequent, replaced by longer silences. Barris noticed that Marilyn seemed to be taking more pills, though she referred to them vaguely as sleeping pills and nerve medicine. She talked about her insomnia, describing nights lying awake until dawn, her mind racing with anxieties, unable to quiet voices telling her she was worthless. The barbiturates helped her sleep but left her groggy the next day, creating a vicious cycle. During one particularly candid conversation, Marilyn admitted she had thought about suicide, though she quickly added she would never actually do it. But the fact that she mentioned it at all stayed with Barris, became one of the details that haunted him after August 5th. The last photographs Barris took were around July 18th, approximately 2.5 weeks before her death. They show a woman who looks fundamentally different from the person in June photographs. The weight loss is visible, her face thinner. The spark has completely disappeared, replaced by exhaustion so profound it radiates from the photographs themselves. After this session, they spoke on the phone about scheduling additional shoots, but Marilyn kept postponing. The last time they spoke was August 3rd, a Friday evening, and during this conversation, Marilyn seemed to have regained some energy. She talked about the book with renewed enthusiasm and made plans to meet Monday, August 6th. She told him something he would repeat for the rest of his life: "I feel like I'm just getting started." These were virtually the last words she spoke to him, a statement of hope that made everything that happened less than 24 hours later even more inexplicable. Saturday, August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe spent mostly alone in her small house in Brentwood. Her housekeeper was present for most of the day, and various people called or visited, though the exact timeline would become subject of intense speculation. What is documented is that Marilyn spoke with several people by telephone, including her psychiatrist, and by all accounts seemed despondent, her voice slurred in a way suggesting she had already taken barbiturates. When exactly Marilyn took the fatal dose of Nembutal that would kill her remains uncertain. What is known with certainty is that sometime in the early morning hours of August 5th, Marilyn Monroe died alone in her bedroom, and when her body was discovered, questions immediately arose that have never been satisfactorily answered. The official autopsy concluded acute barbiturate poisoning and listed the manner of death as probable suicide. The toxicology showed lethal levels in her system, but almost immediately details emerged that didn't fit the suicide narrative. There was no drinking glass found, raising questions about how she swallowed 40 or 50 pills without water. The stomach contained no residue of pills or capsule fragments. The body position seemed unnatural. The timeline provided by witnesses contained inconsistencies, suggesting things had been cleaned up before police were called. And then there were persistent rumors about Robert Kennedy being at Marilyn's house that evening, that relationships with the Kennedy brothers had become dangerous. George Barris, when he heard the news Sunday afternoon, immediately felt something was wrong, that the woman who had just told him Friday she felt like she was starting over would not have killed herself less than 48 hours later. In the weeks following Marilyn's death, George Barris faced a decision that would define the rest of his career. Magazines worldwide were desperate for new images, offering extraordinary sums for photographs from her final weeks. The financial temptation was enormous, but Barris refused every offer, and when pressed, he gave an answer that shocked them. He believed Marilyn had been murdered, and he wouldn't let these photographs support the suicide story. He had spent 6 weeks with Marilyn, had heard her talk about plans, had witnessed her determination to rebuild her career. The woman in those photographs was not someone planning to kill herself, she was someone fighting to survive. So Barris locked the negatives in a vault, releasing only a handful of carefully selected images over the years. He pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, to strange behavior of people around Marilyn that night, to the speed with which her death was ruled suicide, despite ambiguous evidence. He noted that Marilyn had made plans for Monday, had seemed energized during their Friday call, had no history of successful suicide attempts. More than any conspiracy theory, Barris focused on what his photographs showed: a complicated woman struggling but not defeated, exhausted but not hopeless, someone at a crossroads but still moving forward. Only decades later did Barris finally allow the complete collection to be published, wanting the world to see what he had seen through his camera lens in summer 1962, not a tragic figure, but a woman fighting for one more chance. The photographs that George Barris finally released achieved something remarkable. They complicated the narrative about Marilyn's final weeks and forced a re-evaluation of who she was beyond Hollywood mythology. When you look at these images now, knowing how the story ends, it's tempting to see foreshadowing in every frame, but that interpretation says more about us as viewers than about what was actually happening. The truth is more complicated. They show a woman genuinely trying, despite overwhelming obstacles, to change her life's trajectory, to escape the trap that fame had created. The smiling photographs from June capture real hope about the book project and controlling her own narrative. The later images from July show exhaustion and struggle, yes, but not surrender. Even in the most melancholy frames, there's a sense that Marilyn was still engaged in the fight, still trying to find a way forward. What makes the Malibu photographs valuable to history isn't that they predicted Marilyn's death or provided clues to solve the mystery. Their value lies in what they reveal about the human being behind the icon, the real Norma Jean who existed inside the Marilyn Monroe persona. For 6 weeks, Barris had unprecedented access to a woman trying to figure out who she was beyond the roles Hollywood had assigned her. The photographs show someone intelligent, thoughtful, wounded, resilient, contradictory, a woman who had survived an unimaginably difficult childhood, who had clawed her way from poverty to become the most famous actress in the world, and who was still, at 36, trying to believe that better days were possible. When Barris described these images as Marilyn's last light, he was talking about the final flickering of hope in a woman who had spent her entire life fighting, right up until the moment when she either gave up the fight or had it taken from her by forces beyond her control. The question of what really happened on August 5, 1962, has never been definitively answered, and the truth may be impossible to ever know. But the photographs George Barris took remain as testimony to who Marilyn Monroe was in her final weeks, not the doomed tragic figure of mythology, but a real human being trying desperately to survive, to transform, to tell her own story before someone else wrote the ending for her. That she failed in this attempt doesn't diminish the courage visible in these images. These are the last photographs of Marilyn Monroe as she wanted to be seen, complicated and vulnerable, and still reaching for something better, still believing in transformation, even as darkness closed in. That is the legacy of the last light, not a warning or prophecy, but a testament to human resilience, a reminder that even when we know how a story ends, the struggle itself has meaning and deserves to be remembered honestly.